It was just another quiet evening in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The streets were calm, the air still, and everything seemed normal until the flashing lights pierced through the calm. A police officer finishing up his routine patrol noticed an SUV swerving slightly, just enough to raise suspicion. Without thinking twice, he activated his siren and pulled the vehicle over. The officer approached the car, his eyes scanning the scene. A woman sat in the front seat, her hands tight on the wheel, her posture rigid. But it wasn't her that caught his attention. It was the little girl in the back seat, silent, still, and staring ahead with wide, cautious eyes. There was something off, something that felt wrong, but the officer couldn't quite place it. He asked the woman for her license and registration, but as he did, the little girl quietly reached forward, slipping something into his hand, a folded piece of paper. The officer's eyes quickly scanned the note and his heart skipped a beat. "Please help me. I'm scared." This was written on the piece of paper. Why is the little girl scared? Who is this woman driving the SUV? What did the officer do? What happens when a child speaks up in the face of danger? Stay with us for this powerful story. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and click the bell for future updates. Elizabeth Harris, a bright and energetic 8-year-old girl, had always lived a relatively quiet life in the suburbs. She was an imaginative child, known for her curiosity and love for exploring the world around her. Whether it was reading books about distant places or drawing pictures of her favorite animals, Elizabeth was full of wonder. Her parents, Michelle and Richard Harris, always worked hard to create a sense of stability for their daughter. Elizabeth had a safe and predictable routine: school in the mornings, ballet practice in the afternoons, and family dinners on the weekends. For her, life was simple and joyful, a world where the worst thing that could happen was forgetting to pack her lunch for school. The little girl adored her mother, Michelle. To Elizabeth, her mother was the world. Michelle had always been there, the calm force in her life, the one who picked her up from school, who helped her with her homework, who brushed her hair every morning before school. There was a deep trust between them, a bond that seemed unbreakable. Elizabeth's world was filled with warmth, affection, and love. Until that night when everything shifted in an instant. On that evening, Elizabeth sat in the back seat of the family SUV, gazing out of the window as the world passed by. It was meant to be another ordinary evening, a small family road trip to visit a relative in a neighboring town. The routine felt familiar, like every other drive they'd taken. She didn't know it yet, but this trip would be far from ordinary. What Elizabeth did know, however, was that her mother had been acting a little off lately. There were moments when she seemed distant and distracted, even when she tried to mask it with a smile. Elizabeth had noticed her mother's nervous energy, the way her hands sometimes shook when she held the steering wheel. But Elizabeth, being young and trusting, never thought much of it. She loved her mother, and she believed that everything would be fine. But the unease she felt would soon surface in ways she couldn't have imagined. Michelle Harris, a 35-year-old woman, had always been the backbone of her family. A dedicated mother and wife, she worked as a receptionist at a local dental office. Her days were filled with answering phones, managing schedules, and greeting patients with a warm smile. Michelle's life was built on routines, making breakfast for Elizabeth, driving her to school, and coming home after work to prepare dinner for her family. Michelle's marriage to Richard, a steady and dependable man who worked as an IT consultant, had been stable, albeit marked by long hours and an increasing sense of distance. The pressures of life, work, and raising a child seemed to weigh heavily on Michelle, though she rarely spoke about it. On the surface, her life appeared perfect, but beneath the exterior there were cracks, a gradual buildup of stress, isolation, and a sense that something was missing. For months, Michelle had been struggling with her mental health in silence. She had tried to keep it hidden from her family, convinced that she could push through the exhaustion and anxiety on her own. The sleepless nights, the overwhelming sense of fear and uncertainty that clung to her, had become almost unbearable. Yet she kept up the facade. She smiled at work, she laughed with friends, and she ensured that Elizabeth had everything she needed. But Michelle's condition had worsened recently. She had become increasingly paranoid, feeling as though her every move was being watched, as though everyone around her could see through her carefully constructed mask. She wasn't sure who or what was behind it, but she knew she could no longer trust herself. The more she tried to push away the thoughts, the more they consumed her. One evening, Michelle decided to act on these overwhelming fears. She had no clear plan, no destination, just a deep, pressing feeling that she needed to get away. She thought that taking Elizabeth with her, leaving the life they knew behind, would somehow solve everything. Maybe, she thought, if they could just escape, everything would be different. But she was wrong, and deep down, Michelle knew it. As Michelle drove, she became more and more convinced that leaving was the only way to escape the weight that had settled to her mind. But as she looked at her daughter in the rearview mirror, a twinge of doubt surfaced. Was this the right decision? Was she putting her daughter in danger? In that moment, Michelle wasn't sure anymore. The fear and confusion clouded her thoughts. Officer Edward Preston was a seasoned veteran of the police force. At 42 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades patrolling the streets of the suburban town, serving with distinction and quiet dedication. Known for his calm demeanor and methodical approach to law enforcement, Preston had seen it all, from petty thefts to violent crimes, from lost dogs to heart-wrenching tragedies. Yet, it was the small, seemingly mundane moments that always stayed with him. Preston had joined the force straight out of high school, driven by a desire to make a difference in his community. Over the years, he had gained a reputation for his level-headedness under pressure. He had learned how to read people and how to spot small clues that others might miss. His calm voice, steady hands, and keen awareness made him a trusted officer in the department. But despite the years of experience, there were still moments when he questioned his ability to truly understand the people he encountered. On this particular night, Preston was finishing up his shift when he noticed the SUV. At first, it seemed like just another routine stop, a minor traffic violation, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the car came into view, something caught his attention. The driver seemed nervous and distracted. The passenger in the back seat was strangely still, far too still for a child. Preston had learned to trust his instincts, and something in his gut told him that this wasn't going to be a typical encounter. He approached the car with caution, his mind already running through possible scenarios. Was the woman impaired? Was there a medical emergency? Or was something more serious unfolding before him? As he spoke to the woman, Preston kept his eyes on the little girl in the back. There was something in the child's gaze, something that made him pause, made him wonder if there was more to this situation than met the eye. And when the little girl handed him that note, he knew immediately that this was not just another routine stop. In this moment, the lives of Elizabeth, Michelle, and Officer Preston were about to collide in ways none of them could have anticipated. Each of them, unaware of the other's struggles, was about to face a decision that would change their lives forever. As the story begins to unfold, one thing becomes clear. Nothing is ever as it seems on the surface. It was a seemingly ordinary evening. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the suburban streets. Michelle Harris was behind the wheel, driving the family SUV, her daughter Elizabeth quietly seated in the back. It was the kind of drive they had taken dozens of times before, a routine trip out of town to visit a relative. The night was supposed to unfold like all the others, calm and uneventful. But as they cruised down the road, the sudden flash of police lights shattered that illusion. The SUV swerved gently to the shoulder, the hum of the engine fading as Michelle instinctively slowed the vehicle. In the rearview mirror, she could see the officer's car pulling in behind them, lights flashing against the darkening sky. A nervous tension settled over her. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She couldn't pinpoint why, but something about this stop felt different. Maybe it was the sense of urgency she felt inside. the anxiety that had been gnawing at her all evening, a feeling that had only deepened since she'd left the house. In the back seat, Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably, her small body feeling the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Her mind raced with questions. Was this another simple stop? Or was something more wrong than she understood? She looked out of the window, trying to distract herself from the growing uncertainty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The officers' lights flashed behind them, vivid in the reflection of the rearview mirror, illuminating her face in a soft, haunting glow. Officer Edward Preston, a veteran of the local police force, observed the SUV from his patrol car. He had seen this kind of thing before, a minor traffic infraction, a slight swerve, maybe a tired driver, routine. Yet, as he studied the car, something caught his attention. The driver was visibly tense, hands gripping the wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror once more, catching the glimpse of a child sitting in the back seat, far too still, her face hidden in shadow. He approached the vehicle with the practiced calm that had served him throughout his career. He stepped out from the safety of his squad car and walked toward the SUV, noting how the headlights illuminated his uniform, creating a brief moment of distance between the scene and the darkened street around them. When he reached the driver's side window, he gave a polite but firm greeting. "Good evening, ma'am. I noticed you swerved a bit back there. Can I see your license and registration?" His voice was steady and calm, the voice of experience. But as his eyes flicked to the woman in the driver's seat, he noticed something that made him hesitate just for a moment. Michelle turned her head slowly, offering a strained smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, officer," she replied, but her voice lacked the usual confidence that came with a simple exchange between a driver and a cop. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the glove compartment, her fingers slightly shaky as she retrieved the paperwork. There was a certain tension in her movements, an anxious energy that didn't match the situation. Officer Preston stood still, watching her every move, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. He didn't yet know what, but it was there. The subtle change in body language, the unease, the way her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. As Michelle handed him the registration and license, she seemed distant, as though her mind was somewhere else. It was in that moment, while she was distracted, that Officer Preston's attention shifted toward the back seat. His gaze moved to Elizabeth. The child hadn't spoken a word, she hadn't fidgeted, she hadn't even looked up when her mother spoke. Instead, Elizabeth sat there in silence, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes wide and alert. But there was something in her expression, something that made Officer Preston pause. It was a look of fear. Not the kind of fear a child might feel when faced with an unfamiliar officer, but something deeper, a kind of understanding that didn't match the moment. She was afraid, and she was trying to stay calm. The officer's attention sharpened. Was the child upset because of the stop? Or was there something more? He asked Michelle again for her identification, trying to engage her and maintain the usual rhythm of the stop. "Ma'am, I'll just need your ID once more, please." He spoke slowly, deliberately, his eyes still flicking back and forth between Michelle and Elizabeth. The air seemed to hang thick, a tension building between them. Michelle handed him her ID, but her hands were no longer steady. She was visibly distracted, her thoughts racing as her mind struggled to keep up with the situation. Officer Preston noticed the change in her behavior. It was more than nervousness. Her face seemed strained, pale even, and her lips trembled as though she was holding back something. He could sense that something was off. This wasn't a simple stop. At that moment, Elizabeth shifted slightly in the back seat. Her small hands moved toward her lap, and without a word, she slowly slid something across the seat toward Officer Preston. It was a folded piece of paper, small enough to go unnoticed, but just big enough for someone to see if they were looking closely. Elizabeth's eyes met the officer's for a brief moment, and he could see the silent plea in her gaze. There was a weight behind it, a kind of unspoken urgency that made the officer's stomach tighten. He took the paper, unfolding it carefully, not allowing Michelle to see what was happening in the back seat. The words on the paper were brief, but enough to send a shock through him. The moment Officer Preston unfolded the note, his world seemed to slow down. As his eyes traced the words, he felt a cold sensation crawl up his spine. The message was short, simple, and uncomfortably clear. "Please help me. My mom is acting strange. I think she's going to take me somewhere. I'm scared. Underscore." For a split second, Officer Preston stood motionless, his heart rate quickening. The words echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a note. It was a cry for help, from a child who was trapped in a situation far beyond what a normal traffic stop should have been. As the officer held the note, his thoughts raced. There were no clear answers yet, but he couldn't ignore the implication. The child's mother, Michelle, was not acting normally, and that could mean danger. His eyes shifted back to Michelle, still sitting in the driver's seat, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for the officer to return with her papers. The facade of the routine stop was crumbling beneath him. This wasn't an ordinary case of distracted driving. This was something much more complex, and he had to decide how to proceed. His gut told him that time was of the essence. But how much could he confront her without causing panic? How much could he expose before he truly understood what was happening? As he stood there, staring at the note, a wave of empathy washed over him. He had seen people under stress before and had dealt with everything from simple misunderstandings to full-blown crises. But something in Michelle's behavior, something in the child's fearful eyes, struck him deeper than usual. He couldn't ignore it. Officer Preston stood still for a moment, his thoughts racing. He had been trained for moments like this, for crises that escalated without warning. But the situation was delicate. This was not a typical confrontation. He wasn't dealing with a criminal or even someone who had broken the law in the traditional sense. He was dealing with a mother who appeared to be in the grips of something far beyond her control, and a child who dared to speak up at great personal risk. The officer had to walk a fine line. On one hand, his duty was clear. He was sworn to protect and serve. But on the other, there was a pressing human element that couldn't be ignored. Michelle's mental state and the growing distress on her daughter's face were signals that something was deeply wrong. What was his role in this? How far could he push before he lost control of the situation? As he thought about it, a brief flashback stirred in his mind. It wasn't directly related to this case, but it weighed on him just the same. It was a moment from his early days on the force, a time when he had been called to a similar situation involving a family dispute. The father had been erratic, his behavior unpredictable, and it had led to a tragic outcome. That memory haunted him. He had been unable to help in that case, his hesitation contributing to the escalation. The experience had shaped him. It had made him more cautious and more attuned to the way people behaved under pressure, and it made him question his actions. Did he sometimes hesitate when he should act? Did the weight of the situation cloud his judgment when clear and decisive action was necessary? In the back of his mind, Officer Preston could feel the echo of those past mistakes. He couldn't afford to make the same missteps now. His mind raced through the possibilities. Should he confront Michelle directly? Should he ask more questions? Or was there another quieter way to probe the situation without escalating things too quickly? His duty demanded that he investigate further, but something told him that pushing too hard, too fast, could trigger a chain of events that neither he nor the young girl would be able to stop. Every decision from this point forward had consequences. The officer glanced once more at Michelle, her demeanor still frail, but not outwardly aggressive. There was a mounting tension in the air, but she had yet to react with hostility or panic. She seemed entirely unaware that her daughter had passed a note to him. In the quiet of the moment, Officer Preston decided to subtly deepen his questions. "Ma'am," he began, his tone still calm but probing. "Have you been under any stress lately? Anything out of the ordinary that might be affecting you?" Michelle's eyes darted to him, and for the briefest moment, he saw a flash of something, a flicker of recognition that seemed almost guilty. Then she quickly averted her gaze, focusing back on the steering wheel. Her fingers twisted nervously around the edges of the wheel. "No, nothing unusual," she replied, her voice tight. The officer didn't push further, sensing that she was either unwilling or unable to fully open up. Instead, he took a step back, giving her a moment to breathe, but all the while his mind raced. He could feel the uncertainty rising. He needed more information. He needed to understand what was really going on. His gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, and his eyes once again met those of the young girl in the back seat. Elizabeth's eyes were wide, her fear evident, but there was also a resolve in her expression. She hadn't spoken a word, but her face told a story all on its own. With a slight shift in his posture, the officer subtly glanced over at Elizabeth, trying not to alarm her. His training kicked in once again. He needed to remain in control of the situation without making her feel more isolated or afraid. The last thing he wanted was to put her in a position where she felt like she had to defend herself further. It wasn't long before the officer felt the unease bubbling up inside him once more. His instincts, honed over years of service, screamed that he needed to act, but the tension of the moment was suffocating. Every minute that passed without clear answers made him feel more exposed, more uncertain. Could he trust his instincts? Should he take a deeper step to uncover the truth? He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he had to make his move carefully. Each word he spoke, each action he took, had the potential to either de-escalate or worsen the situation. As Michelle fumbled with her purse, likely looking for the last of her documents, Officer Preston decided to change tactics slightly. He would ask her about her daughter, slowly working his way into the conversation without appearing accusatory. "Is Elizabeth doing okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost casual. "It's getting late, and I imagine she's ready to get home." The moment he spoke, Michelle's face flickered. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it didn't go unnoticed by the officer. She seemed to freeze for a moment, her hand still clutching the purse, as if unsure of how to respond. The officer's heart sank. That brief hesitation told him everything he needed to know. He needed backup. But how to get it without alerting Michelle, without making her feel cornered? The next few minutes would be critical. The tension between the officer and the woman in the front seat, and the growing fear in the back seat, was palpable. The decision would have to be made carefully. It was no longer just about a routine traffic stop. It was about protecting a child and ensuring that a delicate situation didn't spiral out of control. As the officer stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, he knew this was no longer just about a citation or a routine check. This was a test of his judgment, his skills, and his ability to navigate a situation where the stakes were higher than he had anticipated. How would you handle this situation? Share your thoughts below. And if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell for more. The note was still in Officer Preston's hand, the child's trembling handwriting imprinted in his mind. Every word seemed to resonate with an urgency that was hard to ignore. He couldn't simply walk away from this, not now. Something in Michelle's behavior, the way her eyes darted, the uncertainty in her voice, suggested that this was more than just an ordinary traffic stop. This wasn't a simple case of a mother who had made a mistake or was acting out of typical stress. There was a deeper issue here, something he couldn't overlook. His gaze shifted back to Michelle, whose hands were shaking as she clasped the steering wheel. The officer had seen this before, though not often. It was the tight grip of someone holding on to whatever control they had left, fighting to keep composure while something was slipping out of their grasp. The officer needed to act quickly but carefully. Michelle's behavior was unpredictable, and pushing too hard now could send the entire situation into chaos. He glanced at Elizabeth in the rearview mirror. The little girl was still there, her small body hunched, eyes wide, her hands pressed tightly together. Her fear wasn't hidden, it was evident in the way she clutched her lap, in the way she avoided looking at her mother or the officer. Officer Preston knew then that he couldn't waste any more time. The child had already reached out for help. It was now his responsibility to ensure that both of them were safe. The officer's mind worked in overdrive, the urgency of the situation pushing him into action. The note was his first clear clue, but it wasn't enough on its own. He had to piece together Michelle's behavior, the way she was distancing herself from reality, her shaking hands, her lack of direct eye contact. These were signs he'd seen in individuals who were struggling mentally but had yet to fully grasp the severity of their condition. Officer Preston took a breath and began to piece together the situation. Michelle's actions weren't just strange. They pointed to something far more troubling. She had been planning to leave with Elizabeth, with no clear destination, no prior arrangements, and no one else aware of their departure. The officer's gut told him that this wasn't a simple case of a road trip gone awry. It was a desperate attempt at escaping something. But what? His mind briefly flashed to a few previous cases. It wasn't rare for a parent to act impulsively under mental distress, to believe they were protecting their child, even when they weren't. Parental abduction was often linked to underlying psychological issues, a delusion of control, a need to run, to escape perceived threats, even if none existed. But this was different. There was no sign of malice in Michelle's actions, no anger or threats. She wasn't a criminal. She was a mother, lost in her own mind, desperately trying to find an answer in a world that no longer made sense to her. He couldn't blame her for that, but he could act to protect her daughter. Elizabeth was the one who had recognized that something was wrong, and the officer could no longer stand by and let it unfold further. It was clear now, this wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. This was a mother suffering, with her child trapped in the middle of it all. The officer's thoughts were interrupted by Michelle's voice, shaky but defensive. "I'm fine," she repeated, her tone becoming more clipped, almost dismissive. She wasn't willing to acknowledge what was happening, not even to herself. She didn't trust him, and perhaps she couldn't even trust herself. "I'm just taking my daughter to see a relative," she added quickly, as though that would explain everything. Her words felt rehearsed, as though she had been telling herself the same thing over and over. But the officer wasn't buying it. The erratic behavior, the sudden decision to leave with no warning, the confusion in Michelle's voice, it all pointed to something he couldn't ignore. Her mind was unraveling, and she didn't even realize the full extent of what she was doing. Officer Preston stood there, his mind racing as he calculated his next move. He had to tread carefully. The last thing he wanted was for Michelle to panic. The officer had seen what happened when someone was cornered, when they felt like there was nowhere to turn. It could end in violence, or worse, a hasty decision that led to irreversible consequences. He took another step forward, his voice remaining calm. "Michelle, I'm not here to make things worse, but I need you to be honest with me. Where were you planning to go? Who were you planning to see?" The question seemed to hang in the air. Michelle's eyes flicked nervously to the side. She wouldn't answer. Instead, she tightened her grip on the wheel, her fingers turning white. "Michelle," he said, this time softer, "I understand you're upset, but I need to know what's going on. Your daughter is scared. I need you to tell me the truth." For a brief moment, Michelle's face flickered. Her lips trembled and her breath caught in her throat. There was a moment, an almost imperceptible moment, where Officer Preston thought she might speak, but it passed, and she shut down again, her eyes darting to the side as though she were trying to escape. "I just need to leave," she murmured, her voice weak. "Everything will be better if we leave. We can start fresh." The officer paused. Her words were fractured, her reasoning distorted. She wasn't just trying to leave. She was trying to escape from something. But what? Michelle's refusal to face the reality of her actions deepened the officer's concern. The delusion that she could just take Elizabeth and leave everything behind was a clear indication of her disconnection from reality. She wasn't in a state to make rational decisions. He could see it now more than ever. Michelle was unraveling before him, her grip on reality loosening with each passing second. Time was slipping away. Officer Preston knew he had to act quickly, but Michelle's fragile state kept him from taking immediate action. Every word he spoke seemed to drive her further into herself, closing her off even more. He couldn't afford to let her retreat any further. He needed her to stay engaged, to stay aware, and above all, he needed her to trust him. But Michelle was in too deep, and Elizabeth was now his primary concern. He subtly reached for his radio, his fingers brushing against it just enough to let him know backup was on its way. His movements were measured, almost imperceptible, careful not to alarm Michelle. He couldn't afford to draw attention to his intentions. He glanced once more at Elizabeth through the rearview mirror. The child hadn't moved, but her wide, frightened eyes locked with his for just a moment. The silent plea in her gaze was unmistakable. She was asking him to help. She had already spoken, and now it was his turn to act. The faint hum of a distant siren grew louder in the background, signaling the arrival of Officer Preston's backup. He had called for help, but he had not anticipated how much the situation would shift with the presence of additional officers. The moment the second vehicle arrived, everything in the air seemed to change. The pressure, the uncertainty, the delicate balance he had been trying to maintain, all hanging by a thread. As the squad car pulled up alongside the SUV, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the tension inside the vehicle thickened. Michelle had been growing increasingly agitated, her breathing quickening with every passing second. Officer Preston's calm demeanor had been the only thing that kept the situation from erupting, but with backup now here, he could feel the shift. Michelle, who had been on edge for some time, seemed to recognize the change, too. Her posture stiffened, her eyes darted nervously between the officer and the new arrivals, and the tightness around her shoulders became more pronounced. She suddenly stiffened in her seat, her gaze sharp and defensive, as though she was bracing herself for something. "What's going on here?" Michelle's voice rose, the first crack of anger he'd seen in her since the encounter began. She shifted in her seat, hands gripping the wheel tightly again, and then her eyes turned back to Officer Preston, clearly unwilling to acknowledge the officers now standing on either side of the vehicle. "I told you I'm fine. There's no need for all of this. I haven't done anything wrong." Her words were now sharper, her tone defensive and desperate. She was losing the fragile grip she had on the situation. The initial calmness, replaced by fear and confusion. Michelle was no longer the same woman who had driven into this traffic stop. She was a mother, panicked, fighting to hold on to whatever was left of her fractured thoughts. The officer stood silently, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. He could feel the mounting pressure on both sides, the instinct to resolve this quickly, battling against the need to keep everyone safe. Michelle's fear was now taking over, and with it came a surge of resistance. She was not willing to back down. She had no idea what she was doing, but her actions, the defensive posture, the tight grip on the wheel, all screamed that she was ready to fight for her perceived control. The tension between them had reached a boiling point, and Officer Preston realized that any wrong move could tip the balance toward danger. The situation was escalating. Michelle wasn't listening. She was shutting down, her mind now in a place where she believed she had no other choice but to defend herself and her daughter. Officer Preston's role, the way he approached this moment, would determine if he could stop her from doing something irreversible. He looked over at the backup officers, signaling them to stay out of the immediate conversation, to watch and wait. The last thing he needed was to spook Michelle even further. He had to maintain control to keep her grounded, and most importantly, he had to protect Elizabeth. The stakes had never been clearer. Michelle's eyes flashed with panic as she looked over at the officers who had now surrounded her vehicle. The additional presence of the backup officers didn't help. It seemed to push Michelle further into her defensive posture. Her breath quickened, the panic evident in the way she spoke now. "Why are you all here? I'm fine. I just need to leave. I don't need you telling me what to do." She was losing control, her voice wavering between anger and fear. It was clear now that Michelle wasn't fully processing the danger she was placing herself and her daughter in. Officer Preston, despite his calm demeanor, felt the crushing weight of this realization. Michelle was unable to see the severity of the situation, and her mind was becoming more frantic with every passing moment. The officers exchanged quiet words, assessing their positions, but they knew better than to move too quickly. They understood the delicacy of the moment. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a woman on the edge of losing everything, and if they weren't careful, things could spiral quickly. The officer stepped closer to the window, speaking in a slow, reassuring tone. "Michelle, I understand that you're upset, but we need to talk. You're not in trouble. I'm just trying to make sure you and your daughter are safe." His words, calm and measured, didn't seem to reach her. Michelle's gaze flickered between the officer and her daughter as if searching for some kind of validation. Elizabeth hadn't said anything for a while. She was sitting motionless, her hands still clenched in her lap, but her eyes were wide, brimming with the kind of fear no child should have to experience. "Is she okay?" the officer asked softly, turning his attention to Elizabeth for a brief moment. His question wasn't for Michelle, it was for the child. The officer realized that this was the moment, the only opportunity he might have to resolve the situation without making things worse. He needed to hear Elizabeth's voice. Her mother had already spoken, but Elizabeth was the one who had reached out for help first. She was the one who had sensed the danger, and now the officer needed her trust. Michelle's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in the entire encounter she snapped, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare speak to her!" she shouted, her hands tightening once more on the steering wheel. The officer flinched slightly, but he didn't pull back. He held his ground. "I'm just trying to help, Michelle. I'm here to make sure you both get the help you need," he said gently, his voice low and steady. But Michelle's anger was building now, the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing moment. It was clear she was about to make a choice that would shape everything from here on out. The officer had hoped that, through calm words, he could ease the tension, but Michelle's mind was clouded, her defenses rising. The lines between logic and confusion were no longer clear for her. As the tension continued to build, the officer realized this was a critical moment. He had no choice but to act. He could feel the rising urgency. The only way to de-escalate this situation was to act before it got worse. The officer's voice softened as he spoke again, focusing entirely on Elizabeth. "Elizabeth," the officer said quietly, his tone warm yet firm, "are you okay?" For a brief moment, Elizabeth's eyes locked onto his, her fear and uncertainty mirrored in her gaze. The officer's heart ached as he saw the desperation in her expression, but she didn't look away. Michelle's breathing grew more ragged as she began to realize the officer was more focused on Elizabeth than on her. Her eyes shot back to the officer, her anger bubbling over once again. "Stop asking her! She doesn't need to say anything!" But the officer wasn't deterred. "Elizabeth," he repeated gently, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "You're safe here. Can you help me? Can you tell me what's going on?" And in that brief moment, Elizabeth nodded. The slight movement, a subtle shift of her head, was all the officer needed to know that the silence had been broken, that the barrier between them was beginning to collapse. "Mom, she's not okay," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's scared, and I don't know where we're going or why we're here." Her words were like a weight lifted from her shoulders, the courage to speak out, breaking through the fear that had paralyzed her for so long. The officer heard them clearly, and at that moment, everything clicked. The truth was out in the open now. Michelle wasn't just acting out of confusion. She was under the influence of something much more significant than just fear or anxiety. The officer glanced at the backup officers, his eyes signaling for them to move in. The moment had come. The situation was no longer one he could handle alone. But he needed to act quickly, before Michelle made another move. The tension in the air was suffocating, and as backup officers approached the vehicle, the officer knew that this wasn't just about restraining Michelle or arresting her. It was about protecting Elizabeth, about making sure that the little girl who had quietly sent out a plea for help was no longer in danger. In this pivotal moment, Officer Preston made his move. It wasn't just a decision between whether or not to take action. It was the realization that the path forward had to be guided by compassion and clear-headed thinking, no matter how chaotic the situation became. As the backup officers moved to secure the area, the officer held his ground, knowing this was their last chance to act before things became irreversible. The officer was faced with a harsh reality. Time was no longer on his side. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Officer Preston had made his decision. The time for subtlety had passed. It was no longer just about questioning Michelle or trying to ease her fears. The situation had escalated beyond that. He had to act to ensure Sarah's safety and Michelle's well-being. With a deep breath, he spoke calmly into his radio, his voice steady but urgent. "This is Officer Preston. I've got a 1055 child in distress. I'm requesting Child Protective Services at my location. This is an urgent matter." The officer's words were clear, his tone conveying the gravity of the situation. Every moment counted now. He had to get help before Michelle's behavior spiraled even further. As he spoke, he glanced at Michelle, who had grown increasingly agitated. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling as she clenched the steering wheel. Her eyes were wild, darting from one officer to the next, from Sarah to the surroundings outside the vehicle. Suddenly, Michelle's expression changed. It was as if the reality of the situation hit her all at once. Her shoulders slumped, her face contorting with distress. She began to sob uncontrollably, the tears flowing freely down her cheeks. It was as though the facade she had been holding up, the denial she had been clinging to, had shattered. The officer watched as Michelle crumbled in front of him, the weight of her actions hitting her with full force. "I didn't mean it," Michelle cried out, her voice broken, trembling. "I didn't want to hurt her. I just didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't stay. I thought maybe if we just left, it would be better. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She curled her hands into fists, pressing them against her eyes in an attempt to stem the tears. Her body shook with sobs, her voice coming in gasps. In this moment, Michelle's vulnerability was raw and unguarded. She wasn't the threatening, defensive figure she had been moments ago. She was a woman at the end of her rope, overwhelmed by the enormity of her thoughts and fears. The officer stood still, allowing her to express her emotions. He understood now that Michelle wasn't acting out of malice. This wasn't an act of rebellion against the world. This was a mother caught in the grip of a mental illness, struggling with the weight of her mind. The officer's eyes softened, but he couldn't let that soften his resolve. His primary concern had to be Sarah. As Michelle wept uncontrollably, Officer Preston turned his attention to Elizabeth. The young girl hadn't moved, her eyes still wide with fear, her small body still intense. For a long moment, Elizabeth's gaze remained fixed on the officer, her face pale but now somewhat calmer. She was processing what had just unfolded, her innocence mingling with the harsh reality she had witnessed. The officer crouched down slightly, meeting Elizabeth's gaze. His voice was soft and reassuring. "Elizabeth, you did the right thing. You're safe now. Everything is going to be okay." The words, gentle but firm, seemed to provide a sense of relief for the little girl. A small sigh escaped her lips as the tension in her body loosened ever so slightly. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. Michelle continued to sob in the front seat, her tears growing heavier with each passing second. "I didn't mean to take her away from you. I just wanted to fix things, but I don't know how. I don't know what's happening to me. I can't think anymore." Her words broke off in gasps, her shoulders trembling with each sob. There was no longer any defiance in her voice, only a heartbreaking admission of confusion and loss. With the arrival of backup, the atmosphere in the car changed yet again. The two officers who had pulled up earlier approached cautiously, watching Michelle with measured concern. Officer Preston gave them a quick nod, signaling that the situation was under control for now. Michelle wasn't a threat, not physically at least, but she was a woman in distress, and the officer's responsibility was clear: protect her daughter and ensure Michelle received the help she needed. "I'm going to get you some help, Michelle," Officer Preston said, his voice still calm and measured. He wasn't sure if she was even hearing him anymore. "We're going to make sure you and Elizabeth are safe. We'll get you the support you need." He turned to Elizabeth again. "You did the right thing by speaking out. I know this was scary, but you helped your mom. You're safe now. Everything will be okay." Elizabeth blinked, her wide eyes beginning to soften as she processed the officer's words. Slowly, she nodded, the tension draining from her small body bit by bit. She wasn't just a child witnessing an adult breakdown. She had become a protector, a quiet hero amid chaos. In the aftermath of the emotional chaos, Officer Preston watched as the other officers gently removed Michelle from the vehicle. She was still crying, her shoulders slumped with the weight of everything that had just come to light. It was clear now that Michelle wasn't in any immediate physical danger to herself or others, but her mental state required immediate care. The officer's role was now to ensure she got that care, for herself and her daughter. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was carefully escorted from the SUV and placed into the back of a patrol car. The small girl, still wearing the expression of quiet resolve, was taken to a nearby safe house where social services would provide her with the support she needed. Officer Preston made a call to Child Protective Services, ensuring that Sarah would be placed with a relative until the situation with her mother could be addressed. As the car drove off, the officer took a moment to reflect on what had transpired. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, but it was a win for both Michelle and Elizabeth. The officer had been able to step in when it mattered most, to take control of a dangerous situation, and provide both mother and daughter with the help they desperately needed. In his mind, the victory lay in the fact that Elizabeth had been protected, and that her mother, despite everything, would get the chance to heal. The hours following the event were a blur. Officer Preston had spent most of his time writing reports and liaising with social services, making sure that both Michelle and Elizabeth were in safe hands. Elizabeth was eventually reunited with extended family members who had been notified by CPS, and Officer Preston could only hope that she would now begin to feel a sense of security that had been absent for too long. The reunion was emotional but bittersweet. Elizabeth was in the arms of her aunt, the only remaining family member who could take her in, and the officer saw the relief in their faces. The world seemed to briefly pause as the young girl was enveloped in love, and Officer Preston was finally able to let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. As the night drew to a close, Officer Preston sat in his patrol car, reflecting on the events. He knew that, while this case ended with a sense of resolution, there were still unanswered questions. Had the family's race played a role in how the situation was handled? It was a question that lingered in the air, unspoken yet deeply important. The officer's mind wandered to the broader context of his work. How different would the outcome have been if the family had been from a different background, perhaps a different race? Would the officer have taken Elizabeth's note as seriously? Would he have hesitated, even for a moment, to intervene? These questions plagued Officer Preston long after the case was over. He understood that systemic biases existed, that the outcome could have been different had either Michelle or Elizabeth been of a different race, or had the officer approached the situation with a different mindset. As he sat in the quiet of his car, the officer vowed to continue asking himself these hard questions, to never stop reflecting on his choices and how they impacted the people he was sworn to protect. The story of Sarah and Michelle Harris would remain with him as a reminder of both the complexities and the critical importance of his role in this system. In moments like these, it's important to recognize that mental health is just as critical as physical health. Many of us, especially those in positions of authority, may not always see the signs of someone in crisis, especially when those signs are subtle, as they were in Michelle's case. Mental health struggles don't always have obvious indicators. They can manifest in ways that are hidden beneath the surface. It's vital, then, that we support not only the individuals who are suffering, but also the systems that are meant to help them. This story is a reminder that every voice matters, that every person deserves to be heard, and that together we can build a world that listens, one where no one is left behind and no one suffers in silence. Elizabeth Harris showed incredible courage in this story, and it raises an important question. What if we all found our voice in times of crisis? Please subscribe and comment with your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe to stay connected for more impactful stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.